Picture this. A queen leads an army against her own husband, the king, and has him locked away forever. Then there's the Countess, who when enemy cannonballs hit her castle, just casually had her maids wipe the walls clean with their handkerchiefs. Oh, and one Duchess, after being jailed by her royal hubby for years, didn't just escape. She helped kickstart a massive rebellion led by her own sons against him. We've also got a Spanish queen, who after years of putting up with her warlord husband, suddenly remembered they were too closely related to be married, and demanded a divorce. And get this, one Italian noblewoman defended her city so fiercely against a massive army, the same army that had already defeated her powerful warlord husband, that she became an absolute legend. Number 5. This countess laughed in the face of an English siege, literally. Meet Agnes Randolph, also known as Black Agnes, the Countess of Dunbar. We're talking mid-14th century Scotland, a time of serious drama between Scotland and England, known as the Second War of Scottish Independence. Agnes wasn't just any noblewoman. She was the daughter of Thomas Randolph, Earl of Moray, a super important companion in arms to none other than Robert the Bruce. So, yeah, fighting spirit was basically in her DNA. Her husband was Patrick IX, Earl of Dunbar. In early 1338, he was off doing important earl stuff, probably fighting somewhere else or attending to Scottish political business, leaving Agnes in charge of their main pad, Dunbar Castle. Dunbar Castle wasn't just any old pile of rocks. It was a seriously strategic fortress, perched on the North Sea coast in East Lothian, Scotland. It controlled key coastal routes and was a major thorn in the side of any English king trying to get a grip on Scotland. And King Edward III of England really wanted to get a grip on Scotland. So, in January 1338, an English army, led by William Montagu, the first Earl of Salisbury, rocked up to Dunbar Castle. Salisbury was no slouch. He was one of Edward III's top commanders. His mission, take Dunbar Castle. He probably figured it would be a fairly straightforward job, especially with the Earl of Dunbar away. A castle defended by a countess. How hard could it be? Famous last thoughts, Salisbury. When Salisbury demanded Agnes' surrender, he got a response he probably wasn't expecting. Agnes, from the battlements, basically told him where he could stick his demand. She had no intention of handing over her husband's castle. Not to him, not to anyone. The gauntlet was thrown. The siege of Dunbar Castle was on, and it would become one of the most talked-about standoffs of its time. Salisbury had all the latest siege tech. He had massive stone-throwing catapults called trebuchets. He had other engines designed to smash walls and break down gates. He was ready for a traditional siege. Bombard the castle, starve out the defenders, maybe try a direct assault. Agnes, however, wasn't playing by the traditional rules of a damsel in distress. The English began their bombardment. Huge stones came crashing against Dunbar's walls. This was the point where defenders were supposed to start quaking in their boots. But Agnes had other ideas. In one of the most legendary moments of sass in medieval history, after a particularly heavy barrage that chipped the stonework, Agnes reportedly sent out her ladies-in-waiting, all dressed up in their finest, with white handkerchiefs. What were they doing? They were delicately dusting off the marks left by the English cannonballs. Can you imagine Salisbury's face? He's trying to terrify her into submission, and she's basically treating his bombardment like a minor housekeeping issue. Talk about psychological warfare. Salisbury, getting increasingly frustrated, decided to bring out the big guns, or rather a big siege tower called a sow. This was a massive, movable wooden tower, covered in animal hides to protect it from fire, designed to get attackers right up to the castle walls so they could storm them or undermine them. As this monstrous sow trundled towards Dunbar, Agnes was ready. She apparently leaned over the battlements and shouted some witty taunts at Salisbury. One chronicler, Bower, records her saying something like, "Beware, Montagu, for thy sow shall soon cast her pigs," meaning her men would capture the soldiers inside. Then, just as the sow got close, Agnes ordered a massive boulder, one that the English had previously catapulted into the castle, to be dropped from the walls directly onto Salisbury's precious sow crash. The sow was smashed to pieces, and the soldiers inside scrambled out, probably very dazed and confused. Agnes had turned their own weapon against them and scored a direct hit. Salisbury wasn't a quitter, though. He tried another tactic: bribery. He found a Scottish guard at the castle gate who was willing to betray Agnes and leave the gate open or poorly defended for a price. Salisbury thought he had her. The plan was for the English to rush the gate at an agreed time. But the guard, perhaps having a crisis of conscience, or maybe just being a double agent, or perhaps Agnes found out, told Agnes about the plot. So, when Salisbury himself led a small party to the gate, expecting it to be undefended, he found Agnes waiting for him. She had the gate dropped just in time, almost trapping Salisbury. He managed to scramble back, but one of his men was caught. Agnes, cool as ever, supposedly quipped to Salisbury, "Adieu, Montagu. I intended that you should have supped with us, and assist us in defending the castle against the English." Ouch! Another plan foiled. Another public humiliation for the English commander. The siege dragged on for 5 long months. 5 months of Agnes Randolph holding out against a superior English force led by a seasoned commander. She managed her supplies, kept her garrison's morale high, and continually outwitted Salisbury's attempts to take the castle by force, trickery, or intimidation. She was everywhere, on the walls, directing defenses, trading barbs with the enemy. By June 1338, Salisbury was at his wits' end. He had thrown everything he had at Dunbar, and Agnes had thrown it right back, often with a sarcastic comment attached. The English army was making no progress, and the siege was costing a fortune. Eventually, Salisbury had to admit defeat. He lifted the siege and marched his army away. Agnes Randolph, the Countess of Dunbar, had held the castle. Word of her incredible defense spread like wildfire. People were amazed. It wasn't every day a noblewoman single-handedly, well, with her garrison, defied a major English army and won. The Earl of Salisbury himself was reportedly so impressed, and probably so frustrated, that he said something along the lines of, "Came I early, came I late, I found Agnes at the gate." He was acknowledging her constant vigilance and unbreakable spirit. Agnes Randolph didn't just save Dunbar Castle. She became a symbol of Scottish resistance and female courage. Her story, passed down through chronicles and songs, highlighted that medieval women could be far more than just passive figures. They could be leaders, strategists, and incredibly tough opponents, and Agnes. She did it all with a style and wit that left her enemies speechless. Number 4. This noblewoman refused to surrender even after her warlord husband was beaten. Let's travel to 14th century Italy, a place buzzing with political intrigue, powerful city-states, and families constantly vying for power. Our leading lady here is Marzia degli Ubaldini, often known as Cia Ordelaffi, a name that would become synonymous with fierce resistance. She was married to Francesco, the second Ordelaffi, the Lord of Forli and Cesena in the Romagna region. The Ordelaffi were a prominent Ghibelline family, meaning they generally supported the Holy Roman Emperor against the Pope in the big power struggles of the time. Francesco was a tough, experienced warlord, known for his opposition to papal authority in the region. The mid-1300s saw the papacy, then based in Avignon, France, trying to reassert control over the papal states in Italy, which had become pretty unruly. Pope Innocent VI appointed a formidable Spanish cardinal, Gil Alvarez Carrillo de Albornoz, as his legate and sent him to Italy with an army to bring rebellious lords like Francesco Ordelaffi to heel. Albornoz was a brilliant military commander and a shrewd politician. This was serious business. Francesco Ordelaffi wasn't going to give up his lands easily. He fought back hard against Albornoz's forces. For a couple of years, from 1353, Romagna was a war zone. Francesco had some successes, but Albornoz was relentless and highly skilled. He gradually isolated Ordelaffi, taking smaller towns and castles and tightening the noose. The Pope even declared a crusade against the Ordelaffi, which brought more forces against them. By 1357, things were looking grim for Francesco. His main city, Forli, was under immense pressure. After a tough siege, Forli fell to Cardinal Albornoz in July 1357. Francesco II Ordelaffi himself was either captured around this time or forced into a very disadvantageous negotiation effectively neutralized. His power base was shattered. For most leaders, this would be game over. Surrender the remaining territories, negotiate the best terms possible, and live to fight another day maybe. But Albornoz hadn't reckoned with Cia Ordelaffi. While Francesco was defeated, Cia was in the nearby city of Cesena, another key Ordelaffi stronghold. And she was having none of this surrender business. Instead of meekly handing over the keys to Cesena, now that her husband was out of the picture, Cia decided to fight. She took command of the defense of Cesena herself. This wasn't just a symbolic gesture. She actively led the garrison and the citizens. Imagine the scene. Cardinal Albornoz, fresh from his victory over the supposedly fearsome Francesco Ordelaffi, now faced Francesco's wife, holed up in Cesena, refusing to yield. He probably expected a quick capitulation. He was in for a shock. Cia Ordelaffi rallied the defenders. She inspired them with her own courage and determination. Chroniclers of the time, like Matteo Viani, wrote about her incredible spirit. She was described as being like a man in her bravery, which was the highest compliment they could pay a fighting woman back then. The siege of Cesena began. Albornoz brought his army, his siege engines, and his formidable reputation. Cia and the defenders of Cesena faced starvation, bombardment, and the constant threat of assault. It was a brutal, grinding affair. Yet, Cia held firm. She directed the city's defenses, organized sorties against the besiegers, and kept morale up within the walls. She was apparently everywhere, a constant presence encouraging her troops. There's a famous story, though its exact truth is hard to pin down like many medieval tales, that highlights her spirit. It's said that when Albornoz threatened her, saying he knew she had the heart of a man, Cia retorted that if she did have the heart of a man, she also had other parts of a man, and she would prove it. Whether she actually said those exact words or not, it captures the defiant, fearless image she projected. She was not going to be intimidated. For months, Cesena held out under Cia's command. This was a major problem for Albornoz. It tied up his army, cost money, and was a bit embarrassing. He had beaten the husband, the main warlord, but the wife was proving to be an even tougher nut to crack in this specific instance. She was outlasting expectations, defying the odds, and becoming a legend in her own time. Her resistance was so fierce that it became a focal point. The siege was incredibly harsh. Albornoz, frustrated by the prolonged defense, employed increasingly brutal tactics. He had a wooden fortress built to blockade the town, and the fighting was relentless. The defenders of Cesena suffered terribly from hunger and disease. Eventually, even Cia's incredible determination couldn't overcome the overwhelming odds and the sheer exhaustion of resources. After nearly a year of heroic resistance, in mid-1358, some sources say earlier, the exact timeline can be a bit fuzzy, Cesena finally fell to Albornoz's forces. The city was sacked, and Cia Ordelaffi was taken prisoner. It was a bitter end to a truly epic defense. But even in defeat, Cia's stand had a massive impact. She had shown the world that even when her husband, a renowned military leader, had been overcome, she possessed the will and the skill to continue the fight. She had outsmarted Albornoz's initial expectations of a swift victory at Cesena, forcing him into a long, costly siege. She had embarrassed him by holding out for so long. Her sheer defiance, her refusal to accept her husband's defeat as her own, was a powerful statement. Cia was imprisoned for a couple of years in Ancona. What happened to Francesco? After his earlier defeat and capture, he eventually made peace with the church, was released, and even for a time served the papal forces, a common practice for defeated condottieri. He eventually tried to regain his power, but was ultimately unsuccessful and died in exile. Cia Ordelaffi's defense of Cesena, however, went down in history. She didn't win in the sense of keeping the city forever, but she won a moral victory. She showed incredible leadership, courage, and strategic thinking in a desperate situation, significantly delaying and frustrating a powerful enemy who had already bested her husband. She refused to be a footnote to her husband's story. She wrote her own incredible chapter of defiance. Number 3. This queen said, "Oops, we're related," to divorce her nightmare husband. Let's head over to 11th and 12th century Spain, a land of Christian kingdoms pushing back against Moorish rule, a period known as the Reconquista. Our focus is on Urraca, Queen of Leon and Castile, a woman who inherited a kingdom in her own right, which was a pretty big deal. She was born in 1081, the daughter of King Alfonso VI of Leon and Castile. Alfonso VI was a major player in the Reconquista, but he had a problem: no legitimate surviving son to inherit his throne. So Urraca, his eldest legitimate daughter, became his heir. When Alfonso VI died in 1109, Urraca became queen. Ruling a medieval kingdom was tough for anyone, and for a woman it came with extra challenges. Many powerful nobles weren't thrilled about a queen regent. To secure her position and provide military leadership, or so the theory went, a marriage was arranged, her chosen husband. Alfonso, the First of Aragon and Navarre, also known as Alfonso the Battler. And boy, did he live up to his name. Alfonso the Battler was, well, a battler. He was a renowned warrior, aggressive, and very ambitious. The marriage, which took place in 1109, shortly after Urraca became queen, was supposed to unite the Christian kingdoms and create a powerful bloc. On paper, it might have looked good. In reality, it was a disaster from pretty much day one. The two Alfonsos, Urraca's deceased father and her new husband, were very different from Urraca's new husband. Alfonso the Battler had his own kingdom of Aragon and Navarre, and he clearly had designs on Urraca's wealthier and larger kingdom of Leon and Castile. He wasn't interested in being a supportive consort. He wanted to be the boss. And Urraca, a queen in her own right, wasn't interested in being bossed around. Clash. Their personalities were also wildly different. Urraca was described as intelligent and politically astute, but also perhaps prone to indecision at times, caught between powerful factions. Alfonso the Battler was a rough-and-ready soldier, devout but also brutal, and seemingly lacking in diplomatic skills when it came to his wife. Chronicles from the period, though often biased, paint a picture of a deeply unhappy marriage. There were reports that Alfonso was physically abusive towards Urraca. He tried to sideline her in government, promote Aragonese nobles in Leon Castile, and generally act like he was the sole ruler. Urraca wasn't going to stand for that. She had her own supporters, particularly in Castile and parts of Leon, who didn't want an Aragonese king dominating them. And crucially, Urraca had a son from her first marriage to Raymond of Burgundy, who had died. Also named Alfonso, later Alfonso VII, the emperor. This young Alfonso became a rallying point for Urraca's supporters and a symbol of Leonese Castilian independence from Aragonese influence. What followed was basically a civil war between husband and wife. Yes, you read that right. Queen Urraca and King Alfonso the Battler, rulers of supposedly united kingdoms, spent a good chunk of their marriage leading armies against each other. There were battles, sieges, truces made and broken. It was incredibly messy and destabilizing for the kingdoms. Urraca showed herself to be a capable political operator during this time. She forged alliances with powerful nobles and clergy who opposed her husband. She used her son's claim to her advantage. She wasn't just passively resisting. She was actively fighting for her crown and her authority. Alfonso the Battler, for all his military prowess, found Urraca and her Leonese Castilian loyalists to be a much tougher opponent than he might have anticipated. He could win battles, but he couldn't seem to crush Urraca's support or force her into complete submission. She always found a way to bounce back, to rally new allies, to continue the struggle. After about 5 years of this chaotic and destructive marriage/war, Urraca, or her advisors, came up with a very clever way out. Throughout their marriage, there had been an underlying issue. Urraca and Alfonso the Battler were actually related. They were second cousins, both great-grandchildren of Sancho III of Navarre. In medieval Europe, the church had strict rules about consanguinity, who you could marry based on how closely related you were. Marrying a second cousin without a papal dispensation, special permission from the Pope, was a no-go. Now, this hadn't seemed to bother anyone too much. When the marriage was politically convenient back in 1109, the Pope at the time, Paschal II, had even seemed to approve it, hoping for a united front against the Almoravids. But by 1114, with the marriage a total wreck and the kingdoms in turmoil, the consanguinity issue suddenly became very, very important to Urraca. She, or her supporters, began to press the case with the church that the marriage was invalid because they were too closely related. This wasn't just a whim. It was a legitimate, canonical reason for annulment. And it was a brilliant political move for Urraca. If the marriage was declared null from the start, then Alfonso the Battler's claims to Leon and Castile through his marriage to her would evaporate. Poof! The timing was key. Urraca pushed for this at a point where Alfonso the Battler was particularly unpopular in Leon Castile due to his heavy-handedness and the ongoing warfare. The argument for annulment gained traction. The papacy, seeing the chaos the marriage was causing and perhaps persuaded by Urraca's diplomacy or the political realities, eventually agreed. In 1114, the marriage was annulled by the Pope on the grounds of consanguinity. Alfonso the Battler was furious. He didn't want to give up his claims on Leon Castile. He continued to fight for a while, but the annulment severely weakened his legal and moral standing. He was no longer Urraca's husband, so what right did he have to her kingdoms? Urraca had effectively outmaneuvered him. She had used the church's own laws to rid herself of a husband who was trying to usurp her power. She had endured years of conflict and abuse, fought him on the battlefield and in the political arena, and then delivered the final blow through a perfectly legitimate and very smart legal strategy. After the annulment, Urraca continued to rule Leon and Castile. It wasn't always easy. She still faced rebellious nobles and had to manage the ambitions of her son, Alfonso VII, who was growing up and eager to rule. But she had successfully defended her inheritance and her authority from her overbearing husband. She had taken him on militarily and politically, and in the end, she had outsmarted him by using the rules of the game to her advantage. Urraca reigned until her death in 1126. She left her kingdom intact for her son, Alfonso VII. Her marriage to Alfonso the Battler is remembered as one of the most dysfunctional royal pairings in history, but Urraca's handling of it, especially the way she engineered the annulment, shows a queen who knew how to play the long game and use every tool at her disposal to protect her crown and her power. She didn't just get a divorce, she got a strategic victory. Number 2. She escaped her royal husband's prison and then foiled a war against him. let's talk about one of the most famous and formidable women of the Middle Ages, Eleanor of Aquitaine. Born around 1122, Eleanor wasn't just any noble. She was the Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right, inheriting a massive, wealthy territory in southwestern France that was larger than the lands directly controlled by the King of France himself. First, she was Queen of France, married to King Louis VII. They went on the Second Crusade together, scandalous, had 2 daughters, but the marriage wasn't a happy one. It was annulled in 1152, officially, because they were too closely related. Sound familiar? But really because they didn't get along, and crucially, Eleanor hadn't produced a male heir for Louis. But Eleanor wasn't single for long. Just a few weeks after her annulment from Louis, she married Henry Plantagenet, Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou. This was a power marriage. Big time. And just 2 years later, in 1154, Henry became King Henry II of England. Suddenly, Eleanor was Queen of England, Duchess of Normandy, Countess of Anjou, and still Duchess of Aquitaine. Together, she and Henry controlled a vast territory that stretched from Scotland to the Pyrenees, often called the Angevin Empire. They were a medieval power couple. For the first decade or so of their marriage, things seemed to go relatively well, at least on the surface. They had a whole bunch of children together, 5 sons, though one died young, and 3 daughters. These kids included future kings, Richard the Lionheart and John, of Magna Carta fame. Eleanor was politically active, often ruling Aquitaine on Henry's behalf or acting as regent in England when he was away. But Henry II was a tough, energetic, and often ruthless ruler. He was also notoriously unfaithful. And as time went on, their relationship soured. Henry was an autocratic king, and he wasn't keen on sharing power, not even with his incredibly powerful wife. Eleanor, who was used to wielding considerable authority in Aquitaine, found herself increasingly marginalized by Henry. He started to take more direct control of Aquitaine, her own duchy. And then there was Henry's very public and long-standing affair with Rosamund Clifford, Fair Rosamund, which was a huge humiliation for Eleanor. By the early 1170s, the family dynamic was explosive. Henry II had a difficult relationship with his surviving sons. Young Henry, crowned king alongside his father, but with no real power. Richard, Eleanor's favorite, designated to inherit Aquitaine. Geoffrey, slated for Brittany, and John, the youngest, nicknamed Lackland because he initially had no lands. The sons were impatient for more power and wealth, and Henry II was reluctant to give it to them. Eleanor, feeling disrespected, sidelined, and angry about Henry's treatment of her and her beloved Aquitaine, and perhaps seeing her sons as allies, sided with them. In 1173, a massive rebellion broke out against Henry II. It was led by his 3 eldest sons, young Henry, Richard, and Geoffrey, and supported by a coalition of disgruntled nobles and, crucially, the King of France, Eleanor's ex-husband, Louis VII, who was always happy to stir up trouble for Henry II. This was known as the Great Revolt. And where was Eleanor in all this? She wasn't just passively watching. According to chroniclers of the time, she actively encouraged her sons to rebel against their father. She had her own grievances, and she threw her considerable influence behind the revolt. This was a huge deal. The Queen of England was essentially backing a war against the King of England, waged by their own children. In the spring of 1173, Eleanor decided to leave Henry and join her sons who were based in France. She reportedly disguised herself as a man to make her escape from Chinon, one of Henry's castles, where she was staying. But she didn't make it. She was captured by Henry's forces near Poitiers, in her own lands of Aquitaine, before she could reach safety with her sons in Paris. Henry II was not amused, not at all. His wife conspiring with his enemies and trying to flee to join an open rebellion. This was treason. Henry had Eleanor imprisoned. And not just for a short time out. Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women in Europe, spent the next 16 years as a prisoner. 16 years. She was moved between various castles in England and Normandy, kept under guard, for freedom severely restricted. For a woman of her spirit and ambition, it must have been an agonizing experience. Even though Eleanor was captured early in the Great Revolt, which lasted from 1173 to 1174, her actions had already set events in motion. Her support lent legitimacy and impetus to her son's cause. The revolt was a massive crisis for Henry II. He had to fight on multiple fronts, against his own sons, powerful barons, and the King of France. He eventually managed to suppress the rebellion, defeated his sons and forgave them, sort of, and reaffirmed his authority. But it came at a huge cost, and the family was deeply fractured. During her long imprisonment, Eleanor wasn't entirely silenced. She became a potent symbol of resistance to Henry's rule. Her treatment was a source of tension between Henry and his sons, especially Richard, who remained devoted to his mother. There are suggestions that she still managed to exert some influence from her confinement, perhaps through correspondence or by her very existence as a wronged queen. Henry II never fully trusted Eleanor again, nor did he release her as long as he lived. He kept her under lock and key because he knew how formidable she was. He knew that if she were free, she would likely stir up more trouble for him, especially in Aquitaine, which she considered hers and Richard's. In a way, by imprisoning her for so long, Henry was acknowledging just how much he feared her political skills and her influence. He had been outsmarted by her initial move to back the rebellion, which caught him off guard and threatened to topple his empire. Her capture prevented her from leading armies, but her spirit fueled the opposition. It was only after Henry II's death in 1189 that Eleanor was finally freed. Her favorite son, Richard the Lionheart, became King of England, and one of his first acts was to order his mother's release. And did Eleanor retire quietly to a nunnery after 16 years in prison? Absolutely not. She was nearly 70 years old, an age when most medieval people were long gone or frail, but Eleanor burst back onto the political scene with incredible energy. She acted as regent in England, while Richard was off on the Third Crusade. She governed wisely, secured Richard's throne against the plots of his younger brother John, and even raised the massive ransom money needed to free Richard when he was captured on his way back from the crusade. She traveled across Europe in winter to deliver it herself. She continued to be a major political force in Aquitaine, protecting her beloved duchy. She outlived Richard and saw her youngest son, John, become king. She even outlived many of her children, dying in her early 80s in 1204. Eleanor of Aquitaine's attempt to flee and join the rebellion in 1173 was a daring gamble that failed in the short term, leading to her long captivity. But it was a profound act of defiance against a powerful and controlling husband. She outsmarted his control by becoming the figurehead of the revolt. Her actions, born of her own frustrated ambitions and grievances, helped to ignite a war that shook Henry II's empire to its core. And her eventual return to power after his death showed that even 16 years of imprisonment couldn't extinguish the fire of this truly remarkable queen. Number 1. This queen invaded England, deposed her king husband, and became a total boss. Okay, buckle up for the story of Isabella of France, a queen who took unhappy marriage to a whole new epic level. Born around 1295, Isabella was French royalty through and through. Her father was Philip IV of France, known as Philip the Fair, a super powerful and ruthless king. So Isabella grew up in a court that knew a thing or two about power and how to wield it. In 1308, when she was just a young teenager, maybe 12 or 13, she was married to King Edward II of England. This was a political match, meant to smooth over tensions between England and France. Standard medieval stuff. Edward II, however, was not exactly prime king material. He was handsome, sure, but he quickly proved to be a disastrous ruler. He wasn't interested in the business of governing. He was more interested in his male favorites, particularly Piers Gaveston, and later Hugh Despenser the Younger. Edward showered these men with titles, lands, and power, which infuriated the English barons, who felt ignored and disrespected. It also deeply humiliated Queen Isabella. Imagine Isabella, a princess from the mighty French court, arriving in England to find her husband the king openly doting on another man, Gaveston. Gaveston was reportedly arrogant and even insulted Isabella. Not a great start to a marriage. Isabella endured it for a while. She did her duty, producing heirs for Edward, including the future Edward III. She was initially seen as a loyal wife, even trying to mediate between Edward and his angry nobles. But Edward II just kept making things worse. After Gaveston was executed by rebellious barons in 1312, yikes, Edward eventually found a new favorite, Hugh Despenser the Younger, and his father, Hugh Despenser the Elder. The Despensers were greedy, ambitious, and ruthless. They accumulated vast power and wealth, alienated pretty much everyone, and treated Isabella with contempt. They reportedly restricted her access to her children, confiscated her lands in England, and even dismissed her French household staff, leaving her isolated and vulnerable. Edward II, completely under the Despensers' influence, did nothing to protect his wife. In fact, he seemed to endorse her mistreatment. By the 1320s, Isabella had had enough. She was humiliated, politically powerless, possibly even feared for her life. England was a mess under Edward II's rule. Costly and unsuccessful wars with Scotland, baronial unrest, and the rapacious greed of the Despensers. Something had to give. And Isabella was about to be the one to make it give. Her opportunity came in 1325. There was a dispute between England and France over Gascony, a territory in France held by the English king. Isabella being the French king's sister, her brother was now Charles IV of France, convinced Edward II and the Despensers that she should go to France as a diplomat to negotiate a peace treaty with her brother. It seemed like a good idea to them. Get the troublesome queen out of the way for a bit. Maybe she could actually sort things out. Big mistake. Huge. Once Isabella was in France, safely away from Edward and the Despensers, she showed her true colors. She refused to return to England as long as the Despensers held power. She publicly denounced them, and by implication, her husband's disastrous rule. And then, she did something even more shocking. She began an open affair with Roger Mortimer, an English baron who had been exiled by Edward II and was a sworn enemy of the Despensers. Mortimer had escaped from the Tower of London in a daring breakout a few years earlier. Together, Isabella and Mortimer became the leaders of the opposition to Edward II. In France, Isabella and Mortimer started gathering support. They raised a small army of mercenaries using Isabella's dower lands, property given to her upon marriage, and possibly funds from her brother and other disaffected English nobles. Her message was clear. She was coming back to England to get rid of the Despensers and restore good governance, with her and Mortimer in charge, of course. She also had her eldest son, Prince Edward, the future Edward III, with her in France. He had been sent over to pay homage to the French king for Gascony, another move that backfired spectacularly on Edward II, as it put the heir to the throne in Isabella's control. In September 1326, Isabella and Mortimer launched their invasion. They landed in Suffolk with a tiny force, maybe 1,500 soldiers. It sounds like a suicide mission, right? But public opinion in England was so strongly against Edward II and the Despensers that people flocked to Isabella's banner. Nobles, clergy, Londoners' support for her grew rapidly. She was seen as a liberator, come to save England from tyranny. Edward II's regime crumbled with astonishing speed. His supporters deserted him. He and the Despensers were forced to flee London. Isabella and Mortimer pursued them. Hugh Despenser the Elder was captured and brutally executed. Then, Hugh Despenser the Younger was caught, subjected to a horrific public execution, hanged, drawn, and quartered as a traitor. Finally, in November 1326, King Edward II himself was captured in Wales. Isabella had done it. She had successfully invaded England, overthrown her husband's government, and destroyed her enemies. Now, what to do with a captured king? Killing him outright was risky. It could create a martyr. Instead, Isabella and Mortimer forced Edward II to abdicate, give up the throne, in January 1327 in favor of his young son Prince Edward, who became King Edward III. Since Edward III was only 14, Isabella and Mortimer ruled as regents in his name. Isabella, often called the She-Wolf of France, was now effectively the ruler of England. And what about Edward II? He was imprisoned, first at Kenilworth Castle, then moved to Berkeley Castle. His fate is one of history's dark mysteries. In September 1327, it was announced that he had died in captivity. The official story was that he died of natural causes. But almost nobody believed that. Rumors swirled that he had been murdered on the orders of Isabella and Mortimer. The most lurid, and probably untrue, story involved the red-hot poker, a method supposedly chosen to leave no external marks on his body. Whatever the truth of his death, it was certainly convenient for Isabella and Mortimer. Isabella and Mortimer ruled England for about 3 years. But their regime became increasingly unpopular. Mortimer grew arrogant and greedy, much like the Despensers before him. And the suspicious death of Edward II cast a shadow. In 1330, the young King Edward III, now 17, and eager to rule in his own right, staged a coup. He had Mortimer arrested, dragged from Isabella's rooms in Nottingham Castle, according to legend, and executed as a traitor. Isabella's time at the very top was over. But Edward III treated his mother with relative leniency. She wasn't imprisoned for long or executed. She was placed in a comfortable retirement, still with considerable wealth and lands, though stripped of direct political power. She lived for another 28 years, dying in 1358. Isabella of France's story is incredible. She went from being a humiliated and marginalized queen to the leader of an invasion, the deposer of a king, and the ruler of a country. Her plan to go to France on a diplomatic mission, then use that as a base to launch an invasion, was a masterstroke of political maneuvering. She outsmarted her husband and his powerful favorites, leveraging her royal connections, her personal grievances, and public discontent to achieve a stunning victory. She played the Game of Thrones, and, for a while, she won. Her actions changed the course of English history.